Welcome to the Voice of Awakening. This is Steve Chippis, and today I'm starting a series on biblical prophecy called End Time Events. In this first video, I'm going to title it Biblical Timeline, How Much Time is Left. So I'm going to give a couple of foundation scriptures here to go along with this video. And the first scripture I'm going to read is from Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. And it says, "But you, Daniel, keep the prophecy a secret and seal up the book until the time of the end, when many will rush to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." So in this fourth verse, it says, many will run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. And we have seen that over the last 25 years, especially. And then in verse 9, it says, "But the angel said, Go now, Daniel, for these words are sealed and kept secret and concealed until the time of the end." So now there's been much debate on when the time of the end is. So I'm going to introduce to you and I personally, because I worked on it for so many years, believe that this is the most accurate timeline that you'll find to date that I know of. And I did a lot of research and watched quite a number of YouTube videos to see and listen to many experts in eschatology over the last 40 years, and then even videos with eschatologists talking like in the 1940s. And I have to say, even though I may disagree with a lot of the things that they taught, or many of the things that they taught, they did terrific for what the knowledge and the information that they had when they made these videos. But now knowledge has increased dramatically, and I'm gonna go over something that's totally astounded me, and it's quite astounding. An archaeological discovery that was done in the mid 1850s that I'm just finding out about it this year. I'm like, how many years did anybody know about this and never mentioned it? And I mean, to me and to an archaeologist, they believe, especially a Christian archaeologist, believes that it's in definitely in the top 5 archaeological discoveries of all time. Because what this is going to do is match and synchronize our calendar to ancient biblical chronological events. So I've been studying, Bible end time prophecy for over 40 years. And in my heart and in prayerfully studying, because the Lord spoke to me quite a bit about the end time and end time prophetic events. And one of the things that I came to the conclusion of is that if we could find out a specific year of Jubilee, we would be able to put all of Bible chronology in exact order. And in my heart, I knew of 2 events just by the Spirit. The Bible says that the Spirit of truth, he shall reveal all truth. In other words, he's the Spirit of truth. And to me, the Lord revealed to me that the Exodus is definitely happened on a year of Jubilee. Right? And I'm gonna explain for people that don't know what a Jubilee is. It's a way of the Hebrews dating their chronology and the way they went through years, and that was given on Mount Sinai and recorded in Leviticus 25. And I'm going to go over that a little bit and then reveal the calendar, where this calendar, it's on my website, voiceofawakening.org, and you can also download it. So I'm going to give a download link to where you can get this copy of this timeline and look at it and study it for yourself. And I am a firmly believe that to really understand and get a better understanding of Bible prophecy, you have to have a reasonable knowledge of biblical history. You have to know historical. It helps to know historical events, why they occurred, how they occurred. To know the history of the nation of Israel, what happened during, what caused the Lord to flood the earth with Noah, during the days of Noah, because Jesus mentions, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. And they will be eating and drinking and giving to each other, marrying in marriage. And so we have to have a general idea, and the church, for some reason or another, well, not only do they not have guest ministers in, there are traveling, I consider myself a traveling minister. I'm not, the Lord never called me to pastor a church. I mean, I know my lane. I'm not going to try to go outside my lane because I want to be in the full-time ministry. It's in my heart. Even though I never made it into the full-time ministry where I drew a salary, it was getting support, either on staff. Even though I've been on staff, I still work, full-time jobs all my life. And now, I don't consider myself old. I believe that the new 60 is the new 40, so to speak. And so, and the Lord renews our youth as the eagles. And the more we see the day approaching and the more the glory of God is in manifestation, if you live in the glory, it slows your aging way down. And I've seen people that live that way over the years. And they looked a lot younger than they were. But I digress from there. So, now getting back to the calendar. Actually, I might as well confess this. It says, confess your faults one to another. This is like the third pass on doing this video. For some reason, I get giddy and I don't know. I go long-winded. Everybody hates a long-winded preacher. You have to know, when to fold them, so to speak. So I want to try to make this short and concise. The last video, I'm not even going to go into what happened where I'm making this one, because I'll start all over again. But so I have to humor myself, how it is. So according to Leviticus 25, the 25th chapter of Leviticus, God doesn't divide the calendar into centuries like we do, but he divides them into 50-year periods called jubilees. And that can be found, like I said, you can read it. That's the Hebrew method. That's the God method. And so each jubilee cycle contains a group of seven-year time periods. So he's kind of matching, like every year in a 7-year cycle is like a mini, week of creation, but they call it the week of creation. And so I just want to touch on this briefly while I'm talking about this. So many people, including astronomers now and Christian astronomers, are teaching that God created the universe in 6 days. And a lot of people believe that that's how long it took God to create the whole universe. But the Bible certainly does not teach that. And that's going to be one of my teachings whenever I get around to making that video, to prove that God didn't create the universe in 6 days. Like people say, that's the 6 days of creation. The correct way to say that is the 6 days of restoration and some creation. So it's not the whole universe. He just restored the planet, and he created man and a new species of animals. After the cataclysmic event that happened before he began on day one in Genesis 2. So it goes like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's verse 1. Then in verse 2, it says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. And the Spirit of the Lord, or the Spirit of God, hovered above the waters. That's verse 2. And then in verse 3, and then God said, let there be light. So from verse 1, he created the universe, the planet Earth, and there was a civilization occupying the planet before the verse 2, where it says, and the earth was without form and void. So the second verse is skipping over what happened and then picking up where the earth was without form and void, and the waters covered the earth, and the Spirit of the Lord, darkness covered the face of the deep. In other words, there was no light, and then there was water, and then the Holy Spirit hovering above the waters. So it sounds like, well, yeah, that's the initial start of when he was forming the earth. But that scripturally does not match up with the rest of what the Bible has to say about it. Now, in Hebrew, when it says that and the Spirit of the Lord hovered above the waters, and you look up the Hebrew for yourself, it says, and the Spirit of the Lord brooded over the waters. In other words, the Holy Spirit, the Lord, was crying. He was very sad, and he was crying over the seeing the darkness of the face of the deep and hovering over the waters. And you say, well, what was that all about? Well, the Bible clearly, as you read on, because the Bible is progressive revelation, we don't get the whole picture of everything. We get it. The Bible says line by line and precept by precept, here a little, there a little. So as we go, further on in the human history, so the whole event's going to start there, the creation of man, and then it is going to, keep going towards God's plan is to restore creation before the rebellion. So what happened there was Lucifer and a third of the angels rebelled, and a lot of the civilization that was here on the planet before God created before he created Adam, rebelled against. There was a rebellion, and so there was a rebellion, and there was a war, and when you look at like the moon, and you look at certain planets and that, and it's cratered. Like God didn't create the planet Mars, or he didn't create the moon with all kinds of rocks banging into it just so it looks pretty, even though it does. He didn't say, well, let me hurl a few asteroids, let me bang a few rocks together. No, there was a war, and there was a warring going on. And so that's what was going on between verses 1 and where verse 2 picks up. And then he goes on, verse 3 forward is talking about where he restored the planet into a habitable, habitable living, and created man and a new species of ocean creatures and in bird. In other words, everything got totally wiped out. The planet was totally lifeless, at verse 2, and then verse 3 is when he started restoring, and he did that in a 6-day period. So that's what one of these 7-year cycles represents, and even each week. So you work Monday through Friday, Sunday, because in the Hebrew there was no day of the Lord, where Christians celebrate Jesus rose on the first day of the week, which is Sunday, right? And then the last day of the week, the seventh day, is Saturday. In the Hebrew day, the day begins at sundown, right? It's sundown, where we begin our day at 12:01 a.m. after midnight. In other words, our day, and then the Hebrew day starts their new day at sundown. And so you have that, and then the Sabbath. So it's like the days of restoration, or we can call it I won't argue to call it the creation, but because there's some creation there. Definitely the most important creation that he did in the 6-day week was to create man. So, and the animals, but mainly man, right? So that's a week, a regular week, and on the God calendar. And then each 7 here, now I'm going to read this again, each 7-year time period. So this is a time period of 7 years, and then the 7th year is called a Sabbath year. Just like in the Bible, that God rested on the 7th day. So we have the 7th year of a 7-year cycle, and that 7th year is Sabbath, and in Hebrew it's Shemitah. So it's a Shemitah. That's where you hear the word Shemitah. It's the 7th year of a 7-year cycle. And then in the Jubilee cycle, there's 7 Shemitahs cycles. 7 Shemitah years. In other words, there's 7 weeks, of a total of 49 years in a Jubilee cycle. So there's a Shemitah cycle is a cycle of 7 years. And then you have a Jubilee cycle, which is a cycle of 7 of those 7 Shemitah cycles, or 49 years. And then the last year of the cycle is the year of Jubilee. And that's found in Leviticus 25. So in my study, if we can find one of those Jubilees, then we can date. That'll help us, really help us to know, in other words, events that I'm going to that you'll see in the calendar. So I know, because even God said, now from here on in, you're going to do the cycles. Right? And in the 7th year of that cycle, they were supposed to let the land rest. So Israel was an agrarian, agricultural. They did farming. When they were in Egypt, they were the farmers that produced all of the food for the Egyptian elites, so to speak. And so when the children of Israel were in Egypt, they were looked down on, for sure. I mean, the Jewish people are looked down on even now in our society. But back then, they were they did all the menial labor, and they were servants. And then what I was going to say there. So then Joseph rose to the governorship in Egypt when the children of Israel had to go to Egypt, and then Jacob ended up in Egypt, and then one of the misinterpretations of the Bible is that they stayed there for a total of 430 years. But there's a discrepancy there because we have the Greek Septuagint, and I'll get into that in another teaching, but you're going to see this in the calendar. So Adam's lease began in 0 a.m. when God gave him full authority over the earth for a set period of 6,000 years, which is called Adam's lease. Right? He called it that. And why was that? I don't see Adam's lease. And I had a lot of trouble with that too. Wait a minute, what is this Adam's lease? I don't see that anywhere in the Bible. And then people say, well, that's Jewish tradition. Right? But when you study the Bible out a little further and you know the nature of God and how he is, so God just like, your children, you're just going to entrust them with anything or with a lot of power, like especially when they're a kid and they're just first learning how to drive. You want to give them a period of testing and proving to see. So God issued this 6,000-year lease to Adam, where he gave him, just like he's the landlord, and then Jesus talked about that in some of his parables. He was referring to Adam's lease and the owner of the vineyard and that in some of the parables, to see what he would do. So God created and restored the planet and created him in 6 days. So the Bible says that a day to the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is of a day. So the Lord issued the 6,000-year period. He would still come down in fellowship, check up on Adam and that. And he was given the directive to be fruitful, multiply, replenish, and to guard. He was to guard the planet. Now, isn't that something? Like, what would he, if he's just created everything a start from fresh, if he just created the whole universe like some people and astronomers teach, then what are they guarding? What does Adam have to guard if the Lord told him he has to guard the earth, right? But that's what he told him. So Anu Monday, or 0 a.m., it's a.m. abbreviates for Anu Monday, which means the year of creation or the year of the world. And that's what the Hebrew calendar is supposed to be. It's supposed to start off at 0, but when I show you the calendar, you're going to see that they're off. And that was very confusing to me. And because I think right now we're in the year 5785 or something like that on the Hebrew calendar. And we're way off. I'm like, Jesus talked about the end. And it's like, oh, my lands, don't tell me, were we 200 years off? I hear, even preachers, they talk about in generations to come, like, when is this thing going to wrap up? I see, if you only could see, like what I've seen, and many of us have seen even from the 1960s until now. Like I've seen, I was very close to the Lord when I was a kid. I was raised Catholic, and I used to hear the Lord speak to me, we weren't allowed to read the Bible, but when that 6-day war broke out in Israel, and Israel ended up, recapturing Jerusalem, the whole world went haywire. And I was a little kid. I was only like 10 or 11 years old, and it's like, what the heck is going on? And I don't want to get into that now. I'll be here all night. This is my third try to make a short video about this. So, The Bible uses here, so Anno Mundi in Latin, the year of creation. The Bible uses the Hebrew method of Jubilees to divide Adam's lease into 120-year Jubilee cycles. Adam's lease ended in 2004, according to this calendar. Wait till you see this, because nobody is really teaching this. This is like breaking news, so to speak. And what's amazing to me is that nobody saw this, because you know why? It wasn't the time of the end. Because Daniel, the angel, said this is going to be sealed up until the time of the end. And the time of the end began in 2004. And you know, so that was the 120th Jubilee, or the 6,000th year of human history. So right now we're living in the 6,021st year, or I believe in September of 2025, it'll be the beginning of the 6,022nd year of human history. That's the time of the end, according to Daniel 12:9. Now we want to synchronize. What, you know, how do you know? What is this, right? That you're coming up with all of this when people, and I've studied, I tried to find out. I said, if we could only know that exact, everybody's guessing. And then, even then, today, they're getting ready to rebuild a temple in Jerusalem, and there's a Sanhedrin. They just appointed a high priest. Like this guy. I'd like to meet him, huh? Wouldn't that be cool, you know, to meet the first high priest since Jesus, right? And that they're getting ready to do this. How cool would that be, that we could, you know, I think it's unbelievable that we're seeing this, but they are going to rebuild that temple, and they're having you know, that's how, even when I was raised, you know, in the Greek families, you argue and they're doing the same thing. The Jubilee, and who's the Jubilees here and the Jubilees there. And they're trying to figure out, they're trying to sync the Jubilees. And then I tried it. I go, well, you know, we had these blood moons back a few years ago, and those were a sign, you know. You couldn't predict Jesus. People were trying to predict Jesus's return off of the blood moons, and this is, you know. And I always felt, you know, if we could know a year of Jubilee, that's going to really be a big help in determining where we're at. You know, how much time we have left, or where we're at. So, synchronizing the calendar. Historical records from a major archaeological find in the ancient city of Nineveh back in the mid-1800s revealed historical events written on ancient cuneiform tablets, and they were found in Assyrian King Ashurbanipal's library. So the archaeologists back in the British Empire, and then they took all of these tablets back to London to be set up in the museum and to be translated and deciphered, right? And then some of the archaeologists back then, the British Empire, and then one guy worked on it for, I don't know, it took him how many years to translate a lot of them into English. Right? Now, one event that he found, so it's just the tablets, and then they're written in eponyms. I don't know why when I get on camera I can't pronounce everything, but it's eponyms, right? And then the Assyrians didn't use numbers, so we didn't have an Assyrian year, you know, that we could use. Not even the Hebrews did the same thing. They didn't have the calendar that they have now. They didn't say, if they did, they messed it up big time. I don't know. Maybe because of the captivities. Maybe because they went into Babylonian captivity and they were at war and there was all kinds of crazy stuff, that happened over the years before they ended up being carried away to Babylon. The Assyrian king here that I'm going to talk about, right? So when they found these cuneiform tablets, they found an ephemerim, right, of a total eclipse that happened in the city of Nineveh, right? So that was recorded. Now, if we could locate that eclipse, then we would know the year that happened on our dating, because the NASA eclipse database uses astronomical calculations, and then the only difference between an astronomical year and our year is that there's no zero. So it goes 1 AD, 1 BC. So when you look at this, when you look up the eclipse that happened during the time period that they were talking about that event, so they got the event within 200 years of the eclipse. So they estimated that it could be in that time period. So that if you ran the reference on the eclipse database, you came up with the date of June 15th, 763 BC. That's when that event, and then now you go backwards, because that happened in 763, and then you come forward on a couple of other dates. So 763 down to 701 was the first event that was recorded on the tablets and the Assyrian historical records, right? It talks about Sennacherib's military campaign against Judah during the 4th year of Hezekiah's reign. So dating that, because even then the Jewish history and theologians don't know the exact. Now we know with this eclipse, we know the exact date, because we know when King Hezekiah started to reign. So this happened in his 14th year. So 701 BC was King Hezekiah's 14th year of reign. And then we can count all the way back to King Solomon. So we simply count backwards to King Solomon's 4th year. So all the years are recorded in the Bible, how many years the kings reigned. Going back through the different kings, Hezekiah and Joah, and all the way back to Saul. That's those David, Saul, going forward, David, Saul, Solomon, and so on and so forth. So we count backwards according to the kings and the recordings that are recording Bible chronology in the Old Testament. And so 966 BC. So in other words, Solomon started his reign. In other words, King David handed over the throne to King Solomon in 971 BC. Capiche? So in other words, and then in the 4th year, and it gives you the month and the day that Solomon began the temple, gives you the month, which coincides with the same time that they were on Mount Sinai. Same time of the year. So you count 480 back from that to know when the Exodus was, which was 2550 on the AM calendar. No, it's 2,550 years from Adam coming forward. But going on the Gregorian calendar, based off of the eclipse in Nineveh, and then figuring out the reigns of the kings, when Solomon, the exact year, and then counting 480 years backwards, you come to 1446 BC. So we know for sure, ironclad, no arguments. People can dispute this all they want. This is calculated from the records in the Bible. Now, unless you don't believe the Bible, many people believe that the Bible and a lot of the Bible is allegorical, which is not. Men back then in Adam lived those kinds of hundreds of years because as each generation came forward, they were exposed to the curse that came upon the planet. In other words, the Lord told Adam, in the day you eat of that fruit, in other words, the day that you specifically eat of that or disobey me, in other words, where you end up rebelling against me for some reason, will be the day that you certainly die. And Adam died spiritually the minute they ate that fruit. They separated sin. Sin came and separated them. There was a great separation between and man's fall, which opened themselves up at the same time, handing the authority of the planet over to Lucifer and coming under the bondage of sin and death. That's why the Bible says that death reigned, and Paul, and I don't want to get into that now, but death reigned from Adam to Moses. So, to really, I'm going to leave a link in the description of this archaeologist. His name is Joel Kramer. He has a YouTube channel called Expedition Bible, and he has a video titled "How We Know the Dates for the Old Testament." And he'll go into great detail. He actually takes you back to look at the ancient city of Nineveh, which is in Iraq, just north of Mosul. I don't know if you're familiar. And to tell you the truth, if there wasn't a war in the Middle East and Saddam Hussein still held power there where we didn't have access, and Mosul was the capital city of ISIS. So it took a long time, but just to revisit, to see if all the archaeological findings that they found in the mid-1800s matched to what we can see today in the ancient city of Nineveh. And what's pretty wild that I totally enjoy some of these videos because it's incredible that such great cities like Nineveh and Babylon, one of the greatest cities ever built, and that you just see regular highways now going, like on Nineveh, you could see two highways. It'd be like, if you live on the East Coast, it'd be Route 95, driving by Nineveh, and you just see the traffic, of cars traveling on the highways, and you wonder, do they know what they're driving by? It looks like, it's up on a hill, but it was like astounding to see, that just what happened there and how great that Mesopotamian civilization was, to where it's just a pile of rubble now because they rebelled again. They didn't want to go the way of the Lord, and this is what ends up happening. And so it's a terrific video, and you'll enjoy that. I'll leave the link. And right now for a second here, I'm going to put up the calendar. Okay, so here's the calendar. Let me bring my mouse over so you can see this. Scroll it. So you can see I titled it Biblical Timeline Calculated from the Nineveh eclipse from 723 BC. Did I say 763? I might have the dates off on that. Wait a minute. Whatever's in here is the right one. Mm-hmm. 763. So I have to change the heading on that. It should read 763 BC on the header. But the date in the calendar itself and the timeline is correct. So we have here 1446 was on a year of Jubilee. And it comes out to 2,550 years from Adam. And I'm not going to get into all the details on how I calculated it. We'll be here all night again, right? Where I just made a video that was too long. So we know, I mean, I'll go home to be with the Lord, or when the Lord comes, to know that the Exodus happened on a year of Jubilee. So I scrolled so I put the calendar together. So the first Jubilee number 1, was when Adam turned 50, right? And then Seth was born. Adam was 130. Enoch, so I skipped over a few of the generations to get to Enoch. So I hit the most important. So Enoch, because Enoch is a type in the shadow of the church. Enoch walked with God and he was not, but God took him. So you can't say that there is no such thing as anybody being caught away. Enoch is the first example. And then Adam is 622 years old when Enoch was born. And then Methuselah was born. Adam was 687. And Enoch was 65 years old. And then Lamech, Noah's father, was born. And Adam was 874 years old. And that was the last generation. In other words, when Noah grew up, in other words, Noah wasn't born until later. So you can just take a look at this here, right? So then in AM, which is Anu Mundi, and it's supposed to match the Hebrew calendar. But when I list the Hebrew calendar here, and I got the dates of the Hebrew calendar and the months and the days, there's a computer program that you can actually transfer. It transfers the Hebrew year to the Gregorian year. And so the Hebrew calendar, according to this real calendar, that really actually goes through the generations all the way up till Noah. It's right there up to Shem. And then Shem's oldest son, I'm trying to think, Aparastad. I have to see his name in front of me to pronounce it. Aparaxad was, and we know when definitely, and we know when they were born. The only one that we really don't know exactly when he was born after that was Abraham. So it gives the exact genealogies. And you say, why Seth? Well, Seth is the line, the genealogy line that Jesus came from. The Messiah line, the Messianic line was through Shem. Through Seth, through Shem, Noah's oldest son, then down to Seth. Excuse me, I'm going to just grab a sip of water. So that's the main reason God wants us to focus in on what he gives details on. He never gave details. We don't know when Cain was born. We don't know when Abel was born. We don't know how old they were when Cain killed Abel, because those events, or where the exactly how the Nephilim came into being before the flood, and then how the Nephilim reappeared after the flood, that the Bible doesn't go into details on how that happened. The reason why, and people major and try to major in some of these things, and you're just coming up with speculation. If the Bible, doesn't want you to know, then there's a reason that God, the main theme of the Bible is the man's plan to come back to God, and man's plan for the future. And then how it'll explain how we got into this mess. So I mean, it gives you quite a bit of details. And, and in the teaching I may touch, it's not that hard to figure out where the Nephilim came from. And I'll give you my take on that, because I don't believe it was there's different. I'm not even going to get into it, because I'll be here another 15 minutes explaining it. But I want to focus in on this calendar. So the only little bit of a discrepancy is with the birth of Abraham. And that, to me, can easily be calculated backwards from the Exodus, because there's a 430-year period where the Bible says that Egypt was in bondage, right? Or was in being oppressed, persecuted and oppressed. And in our Hebrew translation, and in the Bible we use, in the King James and that, says in Egypt. But then in the Greek Septuagint, it says Canaan in Egypt. So because I worked every which way to try to work this calendar, even before I knew about the eclipse that happened in Nineveh, where you can actually go back and accurately record the year that the Exodus took place, certainly 430 years back. That calculation takes me, where I arrive at the conclusion that it happened when Abram entered Canaan. See here, it says, Terah dies at 205. Now, let me see if I can get this pointer to work the right way for me. In 118 after Adam, or 1878 BC, right? That's when Abram went to Canaan. That's when the 430 years began. Some people teach that it happened when God called Abram out of the Ur of Chaldees. So I'm going to have to, on another study, to study the sojourn in the covenant of Abraham and what would happen to Abraham, right? But if you go by that, or go by when 430 years that they were in Egypt, according to now, the eclipse at Nineveh, and going backwards, and then just kept them in Egypt for 430 years, it would totally, I don't know, I forget what year. In other words, it would start running into after the temple. In other words, it would start giving dates where we know for sure that the temple was destroyed 586 BC, right? So it would, the dates wouldn't mesh up. So I thought, well, are the dates from Noah and these births, could these allegorists be right? And maybe we don't really know what's happening, but no. After praying and seeking the Lord and talking to the Lord about this over 40 years, the real interpretation especially proves it with this eclipse that lines up and matches biblical chronology to the eclipse through the Assyrian history that recorded the eclipse, right? It comes to the conclusion that the Greek Septuagint about being oppressed in Canaan and Egypt. Now, why they left Canaan out in our more modern, or the translation of the Hebrew into English, took why they had omitted Canaan, the land Canaan, because now there's a person Canaan also, which is spelled Caian. In other words, there's a Canaan in the lineage recorded in Luke's gospel of Jesus' genealogy, which is also recorded in the Greek Septuagint, and they left that out. Then the Greek Septuagint has the dates and the years that, I don't want to get into a deep study of it now, but it doesn't match. You can't make any of those dates match up. Especially now that we know, you could guess and go, well, then this is when this happened. And then, well, then this is when this happened because of what the Septuagint says. But now we have a surefire date. We know that the Exodus happened in 1446 BC. You can't get around that. And then coming forward to even Noah's time, and when Shem was born, and then Shem's oldest son, it's the Septuagint's right when it says Canaan and Egypt. And then when Abraham was in Canaan, he had all kinds of problems with the other tribes, and he had to fight. They captured Lot. Why did they go after Lot? Because they knew it was Abraham's nephew. That's like his kid. Because Abraham didn't have any kids at the time, right? Say, well, we'll ransom him, and so they kidnapped him, and then they had to go fight. So, and then even while they were there during Isaac, they plugged up Isaac's wells, and so they had all kinds of problems in Canaan. And that started when Abraham moved there. He was so we know a surefire way. The 430 years, no matter what or when, happened in 2120, right? And if you say, okay, 2120, 430 years back from when they left, it was a total, and then even in the movie, the Ten Commandments, it's a common belief that that the children of Israel were under slavery for 430 years. But that's not accurate. The chronology won't line up, but it will line up with them being in the land of Canaan and Egypt, being oppressed. That lines up. So that would be at least when Abraham was 75 years old, right? And he moved to Canaan. And so I could get into, and that's where I really made the video long the last time, getting into what happened, that he wasn't really a moon worshiper, that they were with the Lord, and there was a priestly ministry, and there was people that, especially after the flood, one of them was Shem. Shem was with the Lord, the other two brothers, and then their, ancestors started going away into idolatry and all of that. Again, and that's where Paul's talking, what he's talking about in Romans 1. So Romans 1 makes more sense. Like, who's he talking to? Well, he's talking to the lineages, the lineage from Noah and Noah's three sons, and how the paths that each, they went. And so then coming forward, the next big event happened 1,000 years after the Exodus, on a year of Jubilee. So the year of Jubilee in the Exodus was Jubilee 51. And go 1,000 years forward to 3550 on the calendar, on the AM calendar from Adam. And you come to 446 BC, which was Artaxerxes' decree that began Daniel's timeline. And that happened on a year of Jubilee. like incredibly. And then they argued, well, we don't know when Artaxerxes, it could have been 440. And then, you read other people, no, it happened in 580. And then, so in other words, they would give a year and then 20 years after he began his reign. So you had to subtract 20 years. So there was an argument. I go, well, we're not going to know. So we can't know when Jesus died on the cross. We have to know the exact year. And you say, why didn't we know before then? They could have easily figured all of the stuff out from 1870. They had over 100 years for somebody to discover this and match it all up, and they didn't. You say, so I'm giving you the reason why. The reason why is because we hit that 2004th year, the 6,000th year of Adam's. In other words, we hit the 120th Jubilee. And like people like Charles Capps and Hilton Sutton and other great, Bible prophecy scholars. I used to watch God's News Behind the News, and there was always prophecy summits and yearly, prophecy. They would all get together, and even today there's some good, I forget the names of them that are, So I listen to all of them, and if they ever had this knowledge, this helps. One of the featured channels on this YouTube channel is a channel, with Dr. Billy Brim. So Billy Brim, really, you can get a good explanation and a lot of good teaching on the Hebrew calendar and the Hebrew years. So an appointed. So to give you an example, every Passover, there was and God prescribed this on in the 25th chapter of Leviticus, along with the Jubilees, is they had an appointed time. So they have an appointed time called a moed. So in my teaching, Jesus is coming on an appointed time, at an appointed time. And then the Bible says, in the fullness of time, that Jesus came. The Bible, Paul says, in the fullness of time. Well, that was a moed, in the appointed time. Jesus was born, and when we come, so we know when now. That it's amazing that it falls. So by the Jubilee, just by coming 1,000 years forward, right? From the Exodus to Artaxerxes' decree, 1,000 years to the day or to the month, that's not a coincidence. And on a year of Jubilee. So now you could say, Steve, the year of Jubilee wasn't during the Exodus. No, you're wrong. It wasn't a Jubilee year, please. Come on now. Now, you could, you're trying to tell me the sun is, you're trying to tell me the sky is purple instead of blue. You just study it a little bit, right? The Lord never spoke to me and said, Steve, the year of Jubilee wasn't during the, He told us when it comes to Bible prophecy that we have to calculate. Like he who has wisdom, let him calculate the number of the beast. For it is a man's number. His number is 666. So so now when the beast appears on the scene, all you have to do is calculate it. And I don't want to get into that now, but he's talking about mathematical calculation. The same way now we calculate, right? So we're calculating and putting our calendar to the AM calendar, or the year from creation, from Adam forward. There's 3,550 years, or 1,000 years after the Exodus. You can't tell me that it isn't 446, right? It has to be 446 BC. A lot of the people that do Jewish history say, and even secular history says, yeah, it's around 446. It matches. It comes perfectly in line with the Exodus. And then if you go even forward, now you come to the birth of Jesus. So that's on a year of Jubilee. It happens to be the 80th Jubilee, or the exactly 4,000 year from Adam, the 4,000th year of anniversary of creation. That Jesus was born, and there was a lot of speculation. But when you study it out, where I don't have the names because I'm not teaching on this now, but the governor of Syria, wrote a census decree where everyone had to appear in their own hometown of birth to be counted, and that's why Joseph was living in Nazareth. Right? Joseph was Jesus' dad, and Mary, they weren't born in Nazareth. They were born, they were from the town, they were from the city of, they were from Bethlehem. They were King David's lineage, and they were born in Bethlehem, so they had to go back. And they argue 10. When was that? There is, and then Josephus, that's what makes me laugh too. Everything's on Josephus. Josephus lived 100 years after. He didn't witness Christ's crucifixion. He wasn't even born yet. He didn't witness the destruction of the temple, but he was an accurate historian. And then people argue, you can't go by Josephus. Well, let's hear them argue now that we can't go by a solar eclipse. And that's nailed right into it, unless God, for some reason, and wouldn't he say it, like either slowed down the Earth's rotation around the sun and the moon's orbit around the Earth, or changed the planes, where the Earth, no, it's everything's been the way it was for 6,000 years. God didn't alter any of the astronomical alignments, or you're going to argue that. You can't argue with an eclipse. And so it comes to 4 AD, and that counting, when you get into the study, we'll get into the study of the Daniel's timeline. That's how they knew when to start looking for Jesus. The Magi, how they knew. How did they know when to come? They saw the star in the east, and Moses talked about a star. Moses talked, so Jewish history had it that they were looking for, and in Deuteronomy, Moses called him the prophet. He was talking about Messiah. He was talking about the Lord, right? Jesus. And so they said, well, we know Messiah cut off, and they had, they knew how many years forward they were at the time. And what calendar were they using? Were they using the Hebrew calendar? They knew how to count. They knew they were counting out Daniel's timeline. And so the timeline Messiah cut off was 37 AD. That was the 83rd year of the 490-year calendar of the Daniel timeline, right? 70 weeks of years. That's why it's listed that way in the book of Daniel. The weeks, 70 weeks, and then the 62 week and the 62nd week, and they're talking about this and that. And that Messiah will be cut off. So what are they talking about like that? Because that's how the Hebrew calendar, according to Leviticus 25, is laid out. And then the angel's gonna talk along those lines. So that calculates out to be 4033 or 33 years after Jesus was born. So that matches, because they say some people say, he entered the ministry, he entered in his ministry, he went to be baptized in the River Jordan at age 30. And even though the Bible doesn't give you those dates, just people believed, the Catholic Church, I remember, taught us that Jesus was crucified at the age of 33. And then some theologians said he was 35. And then we know he wasn't 50, because when they called him on the carpet, when Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am," and they said, "How can that be? You're not even 50 years old." So it's still, if you go by that accuracy, that the Artaxerxes decree was done in 446 plus 483, you come up to 4 AD. I mean, that's Jesus's birth, but you come up to 37. So Jesus was crucified in 37 AD. Now you come forward, right? And I give the dates, like when Israel's rebirth, was in, just for the sake, to know, right? And it matches up to 1948. And what did I say we were the Balfour Declaration, right? 5913. Now that we know the right, we have those dates anyway, right? The 4,000th year of human history is year 6,000 in 2004. And when you go from the eclipse, you go from Exodus and count forward, right? And then in 6013, Jerusalem, the capital, moved to Jerusalem, right? Then I hear here, question mark, temple rebuilt. Like I just heard a program today. Well, Jesus can come at any given moment. Well, according to Daniel's timeline, he can't come until after the 490th, the 400, until the timeline restarts. So, and this is what threw the Jews off and discredited Daniel, is because the timeline, if they kept going, Messiah cut off, right, in the 483rd year of the 490-year timeline, or the 69th week. And then they watched 7 years go by and nothing happened. So from 37 AD to like 44 AD, they didn't see nothing. And then 50 AD, they didn't see anything, right? And now the church is, kind of confused. And then now the Jews of today and over the ages wrote off Daniel because what happened? The kingdom Messiah was supposed to come at the end of the timeline. Where is he? And so they discredited that, but actually God suspended the timeline when he began the church on the day of Pentecost in 37 AD. And parables that Jesus told, and there's other passages that hint that the church age is only 2,000 years. And I'll go into that teaching. One of them, one of the teaching is talking about the Good Samaritan. That's one of the parables. When I get into that, will show that the church age is 2,000 years. So does that mean Jesus is coming in AD 37? Well, I can tell you right now, if the temple is rebuilt and they're doing animal sacrifices, so that's 12 years away from where we are, right? And then we're on the verge of World War III. So the Lord spoke to me about World War III, right? And prophetically speaking, he it's not going to be, does World War III begin right at the rapture? Because And then one of my other beliefs is I don't believe that Ezekiel 38, and now I'm getting, this is how I make the video too long. Right? Is getting into these other things, but you're going over the timeline. That Ezekiel 38 isn't a separate event. That Ezekiel 38 is talking about the battle of the end. It's talking about when all nations come. It's the battle of Armageddon, and I'll show you that they're not. It's not Russia coming down to attack Israel with Iran and Libya, and now that could happen. It could be part of World War III. But I personally believe at this point, that World War III, will bring about something major. We're praying. We are the restraining force. And, the Bible does say the Antichrist will be revealed in his own time. So there's a moed for when the Antichrist is revealed. And, maybe not the church could know ahead of time. I heard preachers say, well, no, nobody can know who the Antichrist is until the rapture. But it's talking, when it says reveal, it could be talking about revealed to the world. So we need to catch up. We need to get up to speed, on end time prophecy so we can warn the world. The only means of escape is being born again and come into the family of God. The believers will be, say, oh, you're an escapist. That's right, I am. Because Jesus said, pray that you may escape the things that are coming upon the earth. So the 2000th anniversary of Messiah cutoff, is in 2037. And then I put here in the calendar, rapture of the church. We don't know. How long will the Lord, the Bible does say the Lord waits patiently. But what I can tell you is we are in the time of the end. It's not going to be 50 or 100 years from now. We are it right here, according to this, and according to the things that are being revealed. The things that are the knowledge that's increasing. It's like we can't keep up with it. And so I'm going to end the video there. And I hope you got something out of it. I'm going to leave the let me put myself on film to say goodbye. I get so into talking, I didn't realize that I was still off camera. I could have put myself in the corner, but I'm not a big production company yet. Hopefully, the Lord will help us with this ministry. So if you go to my website and you wanted to download the timeline, right? It's there. I'll leave the links in the description. Also, the link to the video. Definitely watch Joel Kramer's video on how we discovered and how the Nineveh eclipse. He goes in a way greater detail than I do, and you'll find it fascinating because all the videos shot in 4K, and I just love watching those old videos and videos of the old. I call it the old world, but in the ancient world. And so, and if you can think of it, we are a legitimate, this is a full-time 501c3 ministry, Voice of Awakening Ministries. If any pastor or leader would like us to come and minister and teach along these lines, of end time events, we'd be more than happy. I have a contact form and an email in that you can get a hold of us. And if you think, in your heart, you'd want to give something towards, every little thing counts, because we do want to hold seminars. We're still, I'm working on, unfortunately, I'm over the years, I had to work a full-time job, and you get so busy doing that all of a sudden, you're always with the Lord and that, but you're not really pressing towards where you want to go when you get sidetracked into doing other things. So this is Steve Chippis signing off for now. Until the next time, God bless.